The final chapter of the war began not with a battle, but with a choice that would echo across the centuries. Supreme Commander Vorat stood before the Hegemony Council, his scales pale with exhaustion and something that his species had rarely experienced: doubt. The war against humanity had been raging for nearly 2 years, and the losses were mounting faster than anyone had predicted. "We offer terms," Vorat said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "A ceasefire and territorial concessions. We will withdraw from the human colony worlds and establish a neutral zone between our territories. In exchange, they cease hostilities and recognize our existing conquests." The council members exchanged glances. This was unprecedented. The Vrakthi hegemony had never offered terms to anyone. They conquered or they destroyed. There was no middle ground. But the humans had forced them into territory they had never imagined. President Elizabeth Carter received the offer in the White House Situation Room, surrounded by her military advisors and diplomatic staff. Admiral Kevin Hayes was there, along with Vice Admiral Christina Moore, both of them wearing the scars of the long campaign. Commander Laura Bennett stood by the window, looking out at a world that had been transformed by war. "The terms are acceptable," Secretary of State Richard Palmer said carefully. "We get our colonies back, we end the bloodshed, and we establish ourselves as a power that even the hegemony respects. By any measure, this is a victory." Carter nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the document on her tablet. "And what about the 14 species the hegemony has already conquered? What about the concordants, still living in fear that they will be next?" The room fell silent. Everyone understood what the president was asking. Humanity could end the war now, secure in its survival and its independence. Or they could continue fighting for beings they had never met, for a principle that might cost them everything they had won. "Madam President," Admiral Hayes spoke quietly, "our forces have been fighting for 2 years. They are exhausted, our ships are damaged, and our supplies are running low. If we continue this war, we will pay a heavy price." "I know," Carter replied, "but I keep thinking about something Commander Bennett told me early in the war. She said there are things worse than dying. I believed her then, and I believe her now." She stood and faced the room. "When we first encountered the concordants, they asked us to give up our weapons in exchange for peace. We refused because we understood that peace without the ability to defend it is just waiting for the next predator to arrive. But we also understood something else, that our weapons are not just for ourselves. They are for anyone who cannot defend themselves." "You want to liberate the conquered species," Bennett said, not a question. "I want to give them a chance," Carter replied. "The same chance we had. The chance to fight for their own freedom. Can we really call ourselves heroes if we save ourselves and leave everyone else in chains?" The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Humanity would reject the hegemony's offer and continue the war until every conquered species had the opportunity to be free. The news stunned the galaxy. The concordants, which had been watching the war from the sidelines, suddenly found itself confronted with a reality it had never imagined. These humans were not fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for strangers, for species they had never met, for the principle that no one should have to live as a slave. Ambassador Valith requested an immediate audience with Admiral Hayes, who had been placed in command of the combined human fleet. The meeting took place aboard the flagship Dauntless, in a conference room scarred by battle damage that the crew had not had time to repair. "I must understand," Valith said, its translators struggling to convey the emotion in its voice. "You had peace within your grasp. Why did you refuse it?" Hayes considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Ambassador, let me tell you a story. A long time ago on our world, there was a great evil that threatened to enslave entire nations. One country had the power to stop it, but they chose to stay out of the fight, to protect their own peace while others suffered. Eventually, they were forced to join the war anyway, but by then, millions had died who might have been saved. What happened?" Hayes said simply. They learned that evil does not stop at borders. They learned that safety bought by abandoning others is just borrowed time. And they learned that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, not just for themselves, but for everyone. Valit's antennae trembled. The Concordance has forgotten these lessons. We have hidden behind our pacifism for so long that we have forgotten what it means to stand for something. Then perhaps it is time to remember. The ambassador was silent for a long moment, and when it spoke again, its voice was different, harder and more determined. The Corthans have shipyards that have been dormant for 8,000 years. We have scientists who have studied weapons only in theory. We have billions of citizens who have never known war. But we also have something else. Shame. Shame that we cowered while you bled for us. I cannot speak for all of the Concordance, but I can speak for my people. The Corthans will fight. The final battle of the war took place above the Vrakthi homeworld. The human fleet arrived not alone, but at the head of an armada unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Corthan vessels flew alongside human destroyers. Elawari ships, their weapon systems, hastily reactivated after millennia of dormancy, took their positions in the formation. A dozen species that had never raised a weapon in anger now stood ready to fight for their freedom. Supreme Commander Vorath watched the approaching fleet from the bridge of his own flagship, and for the first time in his long and violent life, he felt something that might have been fear. These were not the scattered human ships he had faced at Proxima Centauri. This was an alliance forged in fire and blood, united by the belief that freedom was worth fighting for. The battle was fierce. The Vrakthi fought with the desperation of a predator cornered in its own den. But they were outnumbered now, outmaneuvered by tactics they had never learned to counter, outfought by species that had finally discovered the courage that humanity had shown them. When Vorath finally transmitted the hegemony's surrender, the war was over. In the aftermath, the galaxy was transformed. The conquered species were liberated, given the choice to rebuild their civilizations or join the new alliance that had formed around humanity. The Concordance, humbled by its own failure, began integrating human military advisors and rediscovering the arts of war it had abandoned so long ago. Ambassador Valith wrote one final report before retiring from diplomatic service. It was translated into every language in the known galaxy, and became required reading in academies and schools across hundreds of worlds. I asked long ago if humans feared war, Valith wrote. After 2 years of fighting alongside them, I finally understand the answer. They fear it deeply. They know its costs, its horrors, its lasting scars. I have seen human soldiers weep for fallen friends. I have seen human leaders agonize over decisions that sent young people to their deaths. They fear war more than any species I have ever encountered. But they fear something else more. A galaxy where the strong prey upon the weak unchallenged. A universe where freedom is surrendered for safety. A future where good beings do nothing while evil triumphs. Humans fear war, but they fear cowardice more. And that is why they will always be willing to fight. On Earth, the veterans of the Great War returned home, to parades and celebrations. But the greatest tribute came from the children of liberated worlds, who looked up at the stars and knew that somewhere out there, humanity stood watch. And in schools across the galaxy, students learned the story of the species that had refused to surrender, that had fought against impossible odds, that had bled and died, not just for themselves, but for everyone who deserved to be free. The galaxy had asked if humans feared war. Now they knew the answer, and they would never forget it. 6 months into the war, the Vrakthi hegemony had captured 4 human colony worlds, but their advance had ground to a halt. Every victory had cost them ships and soldiers they could not easily replace. And somewhere along the way, the hunters had begun to feel like the hunted. Vice Admiral Christina Moore stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Dauntless, studying the tactical display that showed enemy positions across the contested sectors. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing, and she had spent the past 3 months making the Vrokthi regret ever hearing the word human. "Admiral, we have confirmed the location of their supply convoy," her intelligence officer reported. "They will be passing through the Kepler asteroid belt in approximately 18 hours. Moore allowed herself a thin smile. "Then that is where we will be waiting. Signal all ships to prepare for silent running. We hit them fast and hard, then disappear before their main fleet can respond." This was the new way of war, the strategy that had turned the tide against the hegemony. Instead of meeting the Vrokthi in direct battle, where their superior numbers would overwhelm human forces, Moore had adopted tactics that humans had used against each other for thousands of years. Guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run attacks, striking at weak points, and vanishing before the enemy could retaliate. The Vrokthi had no word for guerrilla warfare. In their culture, battle was direct and decisive. Predator against prey, strength against strength. The idea of an enemy that refused to stand and fight, that attacked supply lines and communication relays and isolated patrol groups, was something they had never encountered. "It is cowardice," Supreme Commander Vorath declared at the Hegemony War Council. "They hide in asteroid fields and nebulae like vermin. They strike at our supply ships instead of facing our warriors. This is not how war is fought." "And yet they are winning," one of his subordinates dared to point out. "Our losses in the human sectors are triple what we projected. Our supply lines are constantly disrupted. Our garrison forces on occupied worlds cannot leave their bases without being ambushed." Vorath's claws scraped against the table, leaving deep gouges in the metal. "Then we will crush them with overwhelming force. Triple the patrols, double the convoy escorts, flood the region with so many ships that these humans cannot hide anywhere." But the humans found ways to hide anyway. They modified their ships to reduce their energy signatures. They learned to use asteroid fields and gas clouds as cover. They developed tactics that allowed small groups of vessels to inflict maximum damage before escaping into the vastness of space. On the occupied world of New Virginia, a different kind of resistance was taking shape. Former Sheriff Marcus Grant had escaped the initial invasion with a handful of militia members and a burning determination to make the Vrokthi pay for every life they had taken. Grant was 53 years old, with a weathered face and hands that knew how to handle both a rifle and a shovel. Before the war, he had spent his days settling disputes between farmers and writing tickets for speeding. Now he led a guerrilla army that had killed more Vrokthi than any conventional military unit. "They control the cities," Grant told his fighters during one of their hidden camp meetings. "They have the firepower and the technology and the numbers. But we know this land. We know every hill and valley and cave. And we have something they will never have. This is our home, and we will never stop fighting for it." The resistance made life impossible for the Vrokthi garrison. Supply convoys were ambushed on the roads. Communication towers were destroyed in the night. Sentries disappeared from their posts, never to be seen again. The occupation force that should have been securing the planet for hegemony rule instead spent all its time and resources just trying to survive. When Grant was finally captured after a failed raid on the main garrison, the Vrokthi made a public spectacle of his execution, broadcasting it across the planet, as a warning to anyone who might consider resisting. They expected it to break the spirit of the human population. Instead, 3 more resistance leaders rose to take his place, and the attacks doubled. Ambassador Valith watched these developments from the lunar outpost, with a mixture of horror and something that might have been admiration. The Korthan had never seen anything like this, a species that simply refused to accept defeat no matter how overwhelming the odds. They know they cannot win the occupied territories back through guerrilla tactics alone, Valith noted in its reports to the High Council. And yet they continue fighting. They continue dying. Every day I expect to hear that the resistance has been crushed. And every day I learn of new attacks, new casualties, new acts of defiance. I do not understand how they maintain hope in the face of such hopeless circumstances. The answer came at the Battle of Kepler Station, a massive orbital facility that served as the primary hegemony supply depot for the region. Admiral Moore had been planning the attack for months, carefully positioning her forces and gathering intelligence until she knew the station's defenses better than its own commanders. The Vrakthi fleet protecting the station outnumbered Moore's forces 3-1. By every calculation, an attack should have been suicide, but Moore had learned something important about the hegemony. They thought in straight lines, predator to prey, strength against strength. They could not imagine an enemy that would turn their own advantages against them. All ships, execute attack pattern Sierra, Moore ordered as her fleet emerged from the asteroid field where they had been hiding. Target their fighter bays first. I want those carriers blind before they know we are here. The battle was brutal and close, ship against ship, sometimes hull against hull. Moore's vessels wove through the asteroid field, using the rocks as cover while the larger Vrakthi ships struggled to maneuver. Human fighters swarmed enemy carriers, destroying launch bays and trapping thousands of Vrakthi pilots inside their hangars. When the Vrakthi finally broke and retreated, they left behind the wreckage of their finest battle group. Kepler Station was destroyed, along with supplies that would take months to replace. And for the first time in the war, humanity had won a major engagement. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The Concordance, which had been preparing to surrender to the hegemony, suddenly found itself reconsidering. If these humans could defeat the Vrakthi in open battle, perhaps resistance was not as futile as they had believed. On the Korthon homeworld, Valith addressed the High Council with a message that would change the course of galactic history. I have watched the humans for nearly a year now, the ambassador said. I have seen them lose battles and win battles. I have seen them die in numbers that should have broken any species. And I have seen them refuse again and again to accept that they are beaten. I came to study them as a curiosity, a strange species that rejected our offer of peace. I leave understanding that we were wrong, not about them, but about ourselves. We gave up our weapons because we thought that was the path to peace. But the humans have shown us another truth. Peace is not the absence of weapons. It is the willingness to use them in defense of what matters. Perhaps it is time we remembered how to fight. The council erupted in debate, but the seed had been planted. And across concordant space, other species began to whisper about the humans who had taught the predators to fear. The tide was turning, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Vrakthi Advance Fleet emerged from hyperspace above Proxima Centauri with all the confidence of predators who had never known defeat. 200 warships arranged themselves in perfect formation, their dark hulls bristling with weapons that had burned the defenses of 14 species to ash. War leader Krath stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominant Claw, watching the human colony world grow larger on his view screen. Scan for military vessels, Krath ordered, his voice a deep rumble that made his subordinates flinch. He was massive, even by Vrakthi standards, nearly 7 feet of scaled muscle and barely contained violence, and he had personally led the conquest of 3 civilizations. War leader, I am detecting approximately 60 human vessels in defensive formation around the planet. Their technology appears to be several generations behind our own. Krath's lips pulled back to reveal rows of serrated teeth in what passed for a Vrakthi smile. 60 ships against 200. They must know they cannot win. Open a channel and demand their surrender. The transmission was standard hegemony protocol, delivered in harsh tones that left no room for negotiation. Unconditional surrender. dismantling of all military assets, and submission to hegemony governance. The consequences of refusal were made explicitly clear. Captain Nathan Cole received the transmission aboard the destroyer Resolute. He was a lean man with a scarred face and calm eyes that had seen combat on 3 worlds. Around him, his bridge crew waited in tense silence for his response. "Sir, the Vrakthi fleet outnumbers us more than 3 to 1, his first officer noted quietly. Their weapons have greater range and power. By any tactical calculation, we cannot win this battle." Cole nodded slowly. "You are absolutely right, Commander. We cannot win. But that is not why we are here." He opened the communication channel and spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the void of space to the Vrakthi flagship. "This is Captain Nathan Cole of the Earth vessel Resolute, speaking on behalf of the Third Fleet. We have received your terms, and our answer is simple. Come and take it." Silence followed, then a burst of confused chatter from the Vrakthi fleet. They had conquered 14 species, and not once had any of them responded with such casual defiance. Kraft's yellow eyes narrowed as he processed the words. "They refuse?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "They have seen what we did to the others. They know what awaits them." "Perhaps they do not understand, War Leader," his second-in-command suggested. "These humans are young. They have never faced a true predator." "Then we will teach them," Kraft growled. "All ships, attack formation, destroy their fleet, and then burn their colony. Leave nothing alive." The battle began with the Vrakthi advancing in a wall of fire, their weapons tearing through space with deadly precision. The human ships scattered before the onslaught, smaller and weaker, outmatched in every measurable way. Within the first hour, a dozen human vessels were destroyed or crippled. But then, something strange began to happen. The damaged human ships did not retreat. They continued fighting, pouring fire into Vrakthi hulls, even as their own vessels fell apart around them. One frigate, its engines destroyed and its hull breached in a dozen places, drifted directly into the path of a Vrakthi cruiser and detonated its reactor at point-blank range, taking the larger ship with it. Private Danny Sullivan was aboard the carrier Valiant when the first wave of Vrakthi fighters swarmed toward them. He had been assigned to a point defense turret, a small station designed to shoot down incoming missiles and bombers. When the attack came, he found himself firing at targets moving faster than anything he had trained for. "Keep shooting," his squad leader shouted over the chaos. "Do not let them through." Sullivan fired until his weapon overheated, then waited the agonizing seconds for it to cool before firing again. All around him, he could hear the screams of wounded and dying crew members, the alarms warning of hull breaches and system failures. The Valiant was being torn apart, and they all knew it. But they kept fighting. On the bridge of the Resolute, Captain Cole directed the desperate defense with a calm that bordered on eerie. He had accepted that he would likely die today. What mattered now was making that death count for something. "All ships, execute Pattern Omega," he ordered. "Make them pay for every inch." Pattern Omega was not a strategy designed for victory. It was a strategy designed for maximum damage. Human ships stopped trying to survive and started trying to destroy as many enemy vessels as possible before they went down. Destroyers charged directly at Vrakthi battleships, absorbing fire that would have killed them anyway, while delivering devastating close-range strikes. War Leader Kraft watched in growing disbelief as his advanced fleet suffered losses that should have been impossible. These humans were not fighting like a species that wanted to live. They were fighting like a species that had already accepted death and wanted only to drag their enemies down with them. "What manner of creatures are these?" Kraft demanded, as another of his cruisers exploded on the view screen. "Why do they not flee? Why do they not surrender?" No one had an answer. The battle raged for 6 hours. By the end, the Vrakthi had taken Proxima Centauri, their troops landing on the colony world to find the civilian population evacuated, and the military garrison dug into defensive positions that would take weeks to crack. They had won, technically, but the cost was staggering. Nearly a third of Krath's fleet was destroyed or disabled. Thousands of Rakthi warriors were dead, and Krath himself lay dying on the deck of his flagship, mortally wounded when 3 human frigates, their crews already dead from radiation exposure, had rammed the dominant claw on autopilot. As his life slipped away, Krath found himself thinking about the human captain who had answered his surrender demand. "Come and take it," the human had said. Now Krath understood what those words really meant. They were not a boast or a challenge. They were a promise that victory would cost more than any reasonable enemy would be willing to pay. The surviving Vrakthi commander, Sub-Leader Thrax, took command of what remained of the advance fleet. His first act was to send a report back to the hegemony, a report that would send shockwaves through the highest levels of Vrakthi command. "The humans do not surrender," Thrax wrote. "They do not retreat. They fight until death and beyond. I have seen their pilots aim their crippled ships at our vessels and accelerate. I have seen their soldiers fight with wounds that should have killed them. I have seen them smile as they died, satisfied that they had taken some of us with them. We have encountered something new, something we have never faced in 3 centuries of conquest. I do not know what these humans are, but they are not prey." On Earth, the news of Proxima's fall arrived with a somber broadcast that reached every home and every heart. President Elizabeth Carter addressed the world with tears in her eyes, but steel in her voice. "Today we lost Proxima Centauri," she said. "We lost ships and soldiers and civilians who trusted us to protect them. We lost friends and family members who will never come home. But we also sent a message to the Vrakthi hegemony. A message written in fire and blood. We will not go quietly. We will not surrender. And for every one of us you kill, you will pay a price that will make you question whether victory is worth the cost." Across the planet, recruitment centers reported lines stretching around blocks. Factories doubled their production schedules. Scientists worked around the clock on new weapons and new defenses. Humanity had lost the first battle, but they had proven something far more important. They had proven that they could hurt the hegemony, and that changed everything. 3 months after the failed diplomatic meeting, humanity learned why the Concordants had been so eager to bring them into the fold, and the truth was far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. Admiral Kevin Hayes sat in the war room deep beneath the mountains of Colorado, surrounded by screens displaying tactical data from across the solar system. He was a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and eyes that had seen too many battles. And right now, those eyes were focused on the intelligence report that had just arrived from Concordance space. "The Vrakthi hegemony," he read aloud, his voice grim. "A predatory empire that has been conquering systems along the galactic rim for the past 3 centuries. They have absorbed 14 species into their domain, and none of those species exist as free peoples anymore." Lieutenant Commander Samantha Price, his chief tactical officer, pulled up images on the main screen. The Vrakthi were reptilian creatures, standing about 6 feet tall, with scales that ranged from dark green to almost black. Their eyes were yellow with vertical slits, and their mouths were filled with teeth designed for tearing flesh. Everything about them spoke of predators, of hunters who had evolved to kill and conquer. "They respect only strength," Price explained. "Their entire society is built around the concept of dominance. The strong rule, the weak serve, and those who cannot be useful are eliminated. They see the Concordance as a buffet of helpless victims just waiting to be devoured." Hayes nodded slowly, his mind already racing through scenarios and strategies. "And now they have turned their attention toward Concordance space." "Yes, sir. According to the Corthon ambassador, the hegemony fleet is already massing at the border. The Concordance has sent us a warning, urging us to either join them in surrender or prepare for destruction. Surrender. Hayes repeated the word like it was something foul. They want us to surrender to creatures that enslave entire species. The Korthons believe it is the only way to survive, Price said. They are preparing to submit themselves, hoping that compliance will allow them to preserve some fragment of their civilization. Hayes stood and walked to the main screen, staring at the image of a Vrakti warrior. The creature stared back with those cold yellow eyes, and Hayes felt something stir in his chest. Not fear, but something older and fiercer. The same fire that had driven humanity through ice ages and plagues and wars that should have destroyed them. "Get me a secure line to the president," he said quietly, "and start recalling our fleets from every corner of the system. If these lizards want a fight, we are going to give them one they will never forget." Within days, Earth had transformed into a world preparing for war. Factories that had been producing consumer goods switched to military production almost overnight. Shipyards that had been building cargo vessels began constructing warships instead. Recruitment centers that had seen steady but modest numbers were suddenly overwhelmed with volunteers. Private First Class Danny Sullivan was one of those volunteers. He was 22 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in engineering that he had planned to use building bridges and buildings. Instead, he found himself in a training camp learning how to fire plasma rifles and pilot combat shuttles. "I could not just sit at home and wait for them to come," he told his mother during their last video call before deployment. "These things have conquered 14 species, 14 entire civilizations, wiped out or enslaved. If we do not stop them, we will be number 15. His mother had cried, but she had also told him she was proud, and Sullivan carried those words with him like armor as he boarded the transport that would take him to join the Third Fleet. Ambassador Valeth had remained at the lunar outpost, officially to maintain diplomatic relations, but really because the Korthan could not look away from what was happening. Every day brought new reports of human military preparations, new ships launching, new weapons being tested, and every day Valeth grew more confused and more fascinated. "They know what the hegemony has done," Valeth transmitted to the High Council. "They have seen the records of conquered worlds, the images of enslaved populations, the evidence of what happens to species that resist, and yet they are not fleeing, they are not surrendering. They are building more weapons and training more soldiers and preparing to fight." The Council's response was a mixture of pity and bewilderment. The Korthons and the other concordant species had made their choice long ago, deciding that survival through submission was better than extinction through resistance. They could not understand a species that would choose differently. But Valeth was beginning to understand, or at least beginning to see the shape of something it did not yet have words for. There was something in the human eyes when they spoke of the coming war. Something that was not quite madness, but was certainly not the calm acceptance of fate that the Concordants preached. It was defiance, pure and burning, a refusal to accept that the universe had the right to demand their surrender. Commander Laura Bennett came to visit Valeth one evening, bringing a bottle of something called whiskey that the humans apparently drank during times of stress. The ambassador had no mouth suitable for drinking, but it appreciated the gesture. "Your people think we are insane," Bennett said, pouring herself a glass. "I can see it in the messages from your council. They think we are throwing our lives away for nothing." "I do not think you are insane," Valeth replied carefully, "but I do not understand why you would choose almost certain death over survival." Bennett was quiet for a long moment, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. "Let me tell you about my grandfather," she finally said. "He was a soldier in a war we fought among ourselves a long time ago. His unit was surrounded by enemies, outnumbered and outgunned, with no hope of rescue. By any reasonable calculation, they should have surrendered. What happened? They fought for 3 days straight. My grandfather was wounded twice, but kept firing until his rifle melted from the heat. When they finally ran out of ammunition, they fixed bayonets and charged. Less than a third of them survived, but they held their position until reinforcements arrived. Valith's antenna twitched. Why would they do such a thing? Because there are things worse than dying, Bennett said simply. Living as a slave is one of them. Watching your family enslaved is another. My grandfather told me that every man in that unit knew they would probably die, but they also knew that their deaths would mean something. They were buying time for others to escape, for reinforcements to arrive, for victory to become possible. But the hegemony is far more powerful than any enemy your grandfather faced. Bennett smiled, and there was something fierce in that expression. Ambassador, my species has spent its entire existence fighting enemies more powerful than ourselves. We have faced plagues that killed half our population and came back stronger. We have survived ice ages and asteroid impacts and weapons that could destroy cities in an instant. Every time the universe has told us to lie down and die, we have stood up and fought back. She finished her whiskey and stood to leave. The Vrakthi think they are predators and we are prey. They are about to learn that humans are not prey. We are something far more dangerous. We are survivors. As Bennett departed, Valith sat alone in the observation deck, watching Earth turn slowly in the darkness. Somewhere down there, millions of humans were preparing to fight an enemy that had crushed 14 civilizations without breaking stride. By every logical measure, they should have been terrified. But they were not terrified. They were angry, and Valith was beginning to understand that human anger was something the galaxy had never seen before. The ambassador composed one more message to the High Council, perhaps the most important message of its career. I have studied the humans further. I believe I was wrong to pity them. I am beginning to think we should fear for the hegemony instead. The stars had always called to humanity, whispering secrets across the void of space, and for centuries, humans had answered that call with rockets and probes and dreams of what lay beyond their small blue world. But nothing could have prepared them for what they would find when they finally reached far enough into the darkness. Captain Daniel Morrison stood on the bridge of the starship Endeavour, his eyes fixed on the viewscreen as the vessel drifted through the cold emptiness near Jupiter. He was a tall man with graying hair at his temples and the kind of steady gaze that came from 20 years of military service. And he had seen many strange things in his career, but the signal his communications officer had just detected was unlike anything in human records. Sir, the transmission is definitely artificial, Lieutenant Amy Porter said, her fingers dancing across her console as she analyzed the data streaming across her screen. The patterns are too complex to be natural, and they are repeating in what appears to be a mathematical sequence. Morrison leaned forward in his command chair, his heart beating faster despite his efforts to remain calm. This was the moment humanity had wondered about since the first cave dweller looked up at the night sky and asked if anyone else was out there. Can you translate it? He asked. Working on it now, Porter replied, and the bridge fell silent as every crew member held their breath. Minutes passed like hours, until finally the young officer looked up with wide eyes. Sir, they want to meet us. 72 hours later, a makeshift station had been constructed in lunar orbit, a neutral ground where the first formal contact between humanity and an alien civilization would take place. Morrison had been chosen to lead the human delegation, along with Commander Laura Bennett, a diplomatic attaché with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, who had spent her career preparing for scenarios that most people considered science fiction. The alien vessel that approached the station was beautiful in a way that human ships were not. It seemed to flow rather than fly, its hull shimmering with colors that had no names in any human language. When the airlock opened and the alien delegation stepped through, Morrison had to remind himself to breathe. Ambassador Valeth of the Corthan species was unlike any creature Morrison had ever imagined. The alien stood nearly 7 feet tall, with a body that resembled an insect, but moved with a grace that suggested intelligence far beyond any Earth creature. Iridescent wings folded against its back, caught the light, and scattered it into rainbows, and its large compound eyes seemed to take in everything at once. "We greet you in the name of the Galactic Concordance," Valeth said, through a translation device that rendered its clicks and whistles into perfect English. "We have watched your species for many of your generations, and we believe you are ready to join the greater community of civilizations that share this galaxy." Morrison exchanged a glance with Bennett before responding. "We are honored by your attention and grateful for this opportunity," he said carefully. "What does membership in this concordance involve?" Valeth's antennae twitched in what might have been pleasure. "The concordance is an alliance of 47 species who have chosen peace over conflict. For 8,000 of your years, we have maintained harmony across hundreds of star systems. There has been no war among member species in all that time." "That is remarkable," Bennett said, genuine admiration in her voice. "How have you achieved such lasting peace?" "Through the elimination of the instruments of war," Valeth replied simply. "All member species agree to complete demilitarization upon joining. Weapons are dismantled, military vessels are decommissioned, and defensive systems are removed. Without the tools of violence, violence becomes impossible." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Morrison felt his stomach tighten as he understood what was being asked. Beside him, Bennett's expression had grown carefully neutral, the mask of a diplomat who had just heard something deeply troubling. "You are asking us to destroy all our weapons," Morrison said slowly. "All our ships, all our defenses, everything we have built to protect ourselves. It is the only path to true peace," Valeth confirmed. "The Concordance cannot accept a member species that retains the capacity for violence. It would undermine everything we have built. But in exchange, you would have access to technologies beyond your current understanding, trade relationships with dozens of advanced civilizations, and the guarantee that no member species would ever threaten you." Bennett stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Ambassador Valeth, we are grateful for this offer, and we understand the philosophy behind it. But I must be honest with you. Humanity cannot accept these terms." Valeth's wings rustled with what seemed like confusion. "I do not understand. We offer you peace and prosperity. Why would you refuse?" "Because peace bought with helplessness is not peace at all," Bennett replied. "It is simply waiting for the next threat to arrive. Humanity has enemies, Ambassador. We have a long history of conflict, both among ourselves and with the dangers of the universe. We have learned through painful experience that safety must be earned and defended, not simply hoped for. But the Concordance has proven that demilitarization works," Valeth insisted. "For 8,000 years, no member species has faced war." "And what happens when something comes from outside the Concordance?" Morrison asked. "What happens when a species that has not given up its weapons decides that 47 peaceful civilizations would make easy targets?" Valeth fell silent, its compound eyes blinking rapidly. The question seemed to have struck at something the alien had not expected. "The Concordance is strong in its unity," it finally said, but there was less certainty in its translated voice. "Unity without strength is just a larger victim," Morrison replied, not unkindly. "Ambassador, we would be honored to have peaceful relations with your Concordance. We want friendship and trade and the exchange of knowledge. But we will not leave ourselves defenseless. That is not negotiable." The meeting continued for several more hours, but no agreement was reached. The human delegation departed, with promises to continue dialogue. But everyone in that room understood that something fundamental separated humanity from the Concordance, a difference in philosophy that might never be bridged. As the Endeavor pulled away from the station and began its journey back to Earth, Valeth stood alone. At the viewport of the alien vessel, watching the human ship grow smaller against the backdrop of stars. The ambassador had met many species over its long career, had welcomed dozens into the concordance, but never before had it encountered one that rejected the offer of eternal peace. With trembling limbs, Valeth activated a communication link to the Concordance High Council, the ruling body that governed all member species. The message it sent was short, but it would spark debates that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. The humans have refused demilitarization, Valeth reported. When pressed, they spoke of enemies and threats and the need for defense. I do not understand their reasoning. I do not understand their fear. Or rather, I do not understand their lack of fear. Do humans not fear war? The question traveled across light years to reach the council chambers, where beings from 47 species would gather to discuss its implications. None of them could have known that the answer to that question would soon be demonstrated in ways that would shake the foundations of everything they believed. And far away, on a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, humanity continued building ships and training soldiers and preparing for threats that might never come, because they understood something the Concordance had forgotten long ago. That peace was not the absence of weapons, but the presence of those willing to use them in defense of everything they held dear.